So your prospect to customer in order to cash business processes actually support the back office execution of your go-to-market plan. So the last situation that you want to find yourself in is for the sales team to execute flawlessly on their half of the go-to-market strategy when a bunch of business and a bunch of customers, and then once the customers start interacting with your back office, they have a bad experience on receiving invoices, receiving customer support, and trying to pay their invoices. So it's really important to make sure that everything's aligned before you start introducing customers to the back office piece.
Welcome to M&A Science, where leading M&A practitioners share lessons learned from their experience. If you're interested in keeping up with the latest on M&A Science, visit mascience.com. You'll find more about our products and solutions, but you can also sign up for a free newsletter. Every Monday, we share highlights from our interviews and invitations to events as we build the greatest community of forward-thinking M&A practitioners. Again, that's mascience.com. I'm your host, Kison Patel, CEO and founder of M&A Science. Joining me today is Dustin Delewski, Director of M&A Integration Management at Cardinal Health. Cardinal Health is a home healthcare services company trading on the New York Stock Exchange under CAH. Today, we're going to dissect go-to-market for successful integration. Dustin, how you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That's not every day we get somebody from, I just saw today, a Fortune 15 ranked company to come chat with us about go-to-market integration.
Yeah, this is fun.
Yeah, if we can kick things off, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. For the first 13 years of my career, I've held various finance and accounting roles. I've been in this director of integration role for the last 5 years. I'll actually be celebrating my 15-year anniversary with Cardinal Health later this year. My finance and accounting roles have included controller of a distribution center and controller of a large IT SAP implementation project. I have my CPA. I'm a certified management accountant, and I was just recently certified as a post-merger integration expert by the Institute of Mergers, Acquisitions, and Alliances. And just a little bit more about my background, I've been fortunate that the roles that I've held have been in smaller business units within larger companies. And through these experiences, I've gained two perspectives that really helped me out in this role. One, the smaller business units had adopted the level of process standards and controls of the larger corporations. So I was exposed to really high standards and expectations for managing a business early in my career. And secondly, smaller business units are generally run by smaller teams with a larger scope of responsibilities in their areas, which allows you to learn the business processes end to end versus just one or two pieces of a business process. So with those combined experiences, I feel like that really primed me for this integration role.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you developed a very diverse professional background all within the same company. Like, you don't see that too often. It tends to be sort of up one vertical.
Yeah, well, early on it was at Limited Brands when it used to be Limited Brands, but then the past 15 years, all Cardinal Health.
Very interesting. Well, shall we get into it? How do we integrate go-to-market successfully?
Yeah, there's so much to unpack. I would say, and this goes without saying, for any area of integration, you start by creating a set of guiding principles and refer to them often, especially as the team encounters competing priorities and decision swirls. Making sure that these guideposts align with the deal rationale is super important. And then the business should leverage the IMO team to bring a disciplined approach to the table. So for go-to-market, we use a framework that includes an assessment of both businesses across 8 different go-to-market areas. And then we use that assessment to evaluate the integration points and considerations for the various business processes. So for purposes of our discussion today, I'll go deeper into the prospect to customer and order to cash processes. So keeping those go-to-market factors in mind, we start following the framework by completing the go-to-market integration assessment mapping exercise that maps each of these areas to the back office. This aligns the team on the current state of the business, where there's overlaps, differences, and highlights where there's opportunities enabled by the deal. And this helps the teams think through integration considerations, particularly as it pertains to prospect to customer and order to cash.
So we have two main areas, the prospect to a customer and then order to cash.
Yep. So
yeah, can we expand on those?
Yeah. So if you're following along with the slides, I'm a visual person, so I've developed some slides to take us through this. So I'll start by running through a refresher of what those are. Prospect to customer, a lot of times it's referred to as P2C in shorthand. This is the process that supports all the steps from reaching potential customers through winning the business and onboarding the customer. So this is your market intelligence management, your marketing programs, how you manage your pricing, managing your sales pipeline, the authoring and management of your contracts, the customer onboarding, and this also includes the variable compensation. And then for order to cash, often referred to as OTC, that process supports all the steps from ingesting an order from a customer to collecting the cash for that order. So that would include your orders, managing your rebates and incentives, managing and delivering customer service, generating the invoice, performing customer collections, cash application, and then managing your AR, including your bad debt and write-off policies.
Can we go back to the other side and maybe talk through planning? I'm curious to know how planning fits in. So in reference to PTC, OTC, why are they important part of go-to-market planning?
So your prospect to customer and order to cash business processes actually support the back office execution of your go-to-market plan. So the last situation that you want to find yourself in is for the sales team to execute flawlessly on their half of the go-to-market strategy when a bunch of business and a bunch of customers, and then once the customers start interacting with your back office, they have a bad experience on receiving invoices, receiving customer support, and trying to pay their invoices. So it's really important to make sure that everything's aligned before you start introducing customers to the back office piece.
So that makes sense. You'd have to obviously just make sure, like in that whole workflow we talked about, your process is there and you're not just integrating the functions when you don't have every little task covered, so that it flows all together seamlessly. And that's why it's important to have it all mapped out.
Right, because the marketing and the sales team, they built a great product, they're getting sales, and in their mind, the task left to do is just invoice the customer. And there's just so much more that goes into it that the sales team and marketing team might not have visibility into. So doing this exercise with the marketing team, sales team, the business process owners in the room at the same time gets everyone on the same page. And we make sure we don't have any gaps in our integration planning or any bad assumptions.
Yeah, no, that makes a great deal of sense. When so you're running this exercise, looking at all these steps from both sides, that you're looking at your company and also with the target company.
Correct. Yep.
Who's ultimately in charge of mapping out this process?
Yeah, so the IMO facilitates it. They facilitate any workshop meetings, the mapping process, but it's really important for the business to remember that they own the strategy, the processes, and the execution of go-to-market. So really the value of this assessment is dependent on their commitment to the process. The teams that involved in the initial mapping process may vary by business and depend on where we are in the deal timeline. You may have constraints to access some resources, if you're really early in the deal. But we try to include representation from marketing, business development, sales, finance, general managers, business process owners, and commercial technology support.
So I'm trying to get a sense, Dustin, of it just sounds like it starts pretty simple. And as you get access to more information and more people on the other side, it just gets a lot more detailed and comprehensive. Is it fair to say it's a pretty iterative process, like early stages, thinking of strategy, thinking of the big picture, and then it's shaping through a series of events and maybe meetings to detail things out as you go? Or is it just big chunky milestones? Like, what does it actually look like when you're shaping all this to build this plan?
Yeah, it's a very iterative process. And I think it would help if I walk through what this framework looked like. So it's a grid where we have the different marketing go-to-market areas across the top. We focus on 8 of them. So this is what works for us. Different businesses might align these differently, but we look at market strategy, customers, distribution channels, products and services, value drivers, organizational structure and employees, sales incentives, and then the sales and processes and enablers. And so for each of these, and like you said, it's an iterative process. You'll go through this again and again and again, depending on how the deal structure, it'll become very apparent where we need to focus our time and energy. But ideally, you would map out the current state of the acquiring business, the current state of the target business, and then using that information to call out areas that overlap, areas that have net new capabilities. And this is where some of your deal revenue synergies may show up. So this would have a big star next to it that this is high priority for integration. And then within each of these areas, we can map them to the integration points and considerations related to them. So as we all know, each deal is different and nuanced. So it's possible that some of these buckets wouldn't be relevant for the assessment process for every deal, but it doesn't hurt to go through the complete exercise at least once so you can rule out scope. It's easier to rule out scope than make an assumption that there isn't scope there and then you have to go back later and turns out there is. So I can dive a little deeper into each of these areas and take you through how I'd map them to order to cash and prospect to customer.
I think that would be very helpful. So far, I'm getting that you're building out your go-to-market workflow from both sides, your organization, the target organization, and you're identifying essentially the revenue synergies and prioritizing them as you identify them. A lot of agile stuff here because you got this continuous prioritization, the iterations.
Yeah.
And then it'd be great just to walk through the approach that you have or the segments that you've outlined and just to give a good example.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first area we dive into is the market strategy evaluation. So this is where we would have documentation of the scope and size of the market, any market geographies, growth opportunities as a result of the deal. We would highlight market trends relevant to the deal impacts on the sales pipeline of each business, brand recognition considerations are big here, and then any strengths and weaknesses. So you're kind of doing a SWOT at the same time, but really, getting the team to get the lay of the land and diving in a little bit deeper than they may have during the initial management meetings. And so for market strategy, as it maps to the prospect to customer integration, you'd want to think about how the decisions you're making in your marketing strategy, all those components that I just listed, what do we need to do with our market intelligence management? Do we have any integration points there? How we're managing marketing programs, any branding decisions, any marketing collateral that needs to be updated. Do we need to consider the sales pipeline process? For order to cash, the process components to consider would be any documents that the customers receive that include any branding. So if you're going to do a rebrand or co-branding, you actually have to go through and update the logo on any customer-facing document, invoices, statements, dunning letters. So any document that's a result of the order to cash process. And anyone who has had to do that before in technology, it's a lot more complicated than it sounds. So it's good to plan for that and budget for it in your integration budget.
Which is a whole other topic.
Right.
So we get marketing strategy figured out.
Yep.
This is when we figure out what's the joint brand's going to look like, and that kind of stuff.
Yep. Yeah. If you're, if you're buying a business that has a complementary product, how are we going to bundle those together? What's the story we're going to tell? So that will take a lot more integration thinking. If you are buying a business where it's the exact same product and maybe you're just entering into a new geography, you might not have that much to integrate into because there are so many similarities.
Now, are you working with different leaders through these different areas?
Yes. Yep. So
Okay.
we typically have a business sponsor, executive business sponsor, but then we have leaders in each of the functional areas. So I'll move into the customer evaluation. For this area, the team will document the customer segmentation, any customer satisfaction measures and scoring, customer types, counts, key customers, contract structures, any customer journey mapping, strengths and weaknesses. I think that's really telling, things like customer journey mapping. If the other side doesn't have that, then there's probably some work to do before you even can start integrating. You kind of have to know where you are to know where you're going. The integrate.
Would it make sense to do that first, to start customer journey mapping before you do all this?
Yeah. So if we sat down and we were going through this and was like, okay, we have our customer journey map. What's yours? And they say we don't have one. Then maybe take a step back and say, okay, before we continue down this assessment, or in parallel, let's map out your customer journey.
Okay, and that call comes within and your customer segment.
And sometimes it's nice to have. It just kind of depends on where a business is and their life cycle. If you have like a really small team, they may not have something like a customer journey map.
That's when you tell them you should have one.
And it might be tribal knowledge, right? Everyone has it in their head, and it's just a matter of getting it down on paper. So for the customer integration points, for prospect to customer, that it could include the pricing process, customer contract structuring. So it may be that if you're buying an entity that has complementary products or services that your current customers would use, then you'll have to think through amendments and addendums to the current contracts for those new products or offerings. Customer contract structuring is really tricky. So this is a really thing to dive deep in when you're integrating, because a lot of times the contracting team and the sales team will write contracts that the system can't process. Like the system's not built right. And so you end up with a lot of manual processing outside of the system. So for example, if you have some SLA reporting to do, and that's not captured in any of your systems, that means someone on the team will need to manually track any sort of SLA. So any new customers would need to be onboarded into the prevailing prospect to customer or order to cash system. So if you are migrating from one system to the other, such as your ERP or your CRM system. So there's a whole data alignment, cleansing, and migration process that happens there. And then for order to cash, the process components to consider would be anything in the process, especially if there's significant increases in transaction volume. So if your process can handle 100 customers and you're actually buying a business that will double that or significantly increase it, you really have to take a look to see if your processes and your teams can handle that volume. There's the data mapping I mentioned, figuring out which bank account the receivables should go to, customer service integration and training, profitability reporting, your receivables management, and bad debt assumptions. And this is where the communications team and any customer change management resources should be leveraged to roll out any customer-facing changes. So there's a lot going on here, especially if you're integrating a business with completely new customer segmentation.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a big difference between there's a significant overlap in customers. Maybe you're buying something that's already in your ecosystem and there's a lot of overlap versus entering a new area that has all new customers. Sounds like that would affect a lot of the considerations around these areas and prompt more changes versus
Yep,
not.
correct. I'll move on to the distribution channel evaluation. So this includes your distributor identification, channel types, partner performance, geography, any technology-enabled ordering, strengths and weaknesses. And so from an order to cash and prospect to customer, really the biggest implication here is your ordering. As an aside, the other business process that would be heavy here would be your make to distribute or receive to distribute business processes, depending on if you have manufacturing or warehousing components. So basically, this is more of your supply chain side of the equation. So moving on to products and services, and you'll see some of this overlaps, like with the pricing and the contracting, depending on from which angle you're approaching it, either at the customer pricing strategy versus a product pricing strategy. That's why you see things listed multiple times. So the products and services portfolio of each business, their value props, the pricing strategy, strengths and weaknesses. And then for prospect to customer, this will tie back to your pricing strategy and management and your customer contracts implications. For order to cash, items to consider would be the product master data, any new revenue streams. And I'll highlight this area. I mentioned it earlier, but new revenue streams are a real simple litmus test on how complex your integration is going to be. If you're acquiring a business that has new revenue streams that are different from your current revenue streams, so an example would be if you're a distribution company, so your revenue is coming from moving boxes around, and you want to get into the business of adding a technology-based service or vice versa, your current order to cash process team and system will probably need a lot of work to accommodate any new revenue streams because they were built around the current revenue stream. Businesses tend to build their systems around their processes. So I think this is an area where leaders really underestimate the level of effort to make changes and additions to like order ingestion, processing, and invoicing. It's really more involved than adding a few new billing codes. So this is an area where you want to make sure you have a lot of integration budget set aside. I'll move on to the value drivers evaluation. So this one is a little more ambiguous and very specific to the business. It's basically your value drivers for each business. So that could include key capabilities. All right, so the way this bucket would map to both prospect to customer and order to cash integration would be dependent on what the team identifies in this section as the value drivers, because they're very specific. However, it should be noted that this section is important because what the team does identify as a value driver should drive the integration priorities and urgency. So we don't want to disrupt the current value drivers, and we want to implement the infrastructure to support the new value drivers as quickly as possible.
Who would own that with you? Who would you work with in leadership?
I mean, I think, it's who owns that value driver? Where does the value driver fit? Is the value in a product? Is the value in the way that we interact with the customer? It could be, part of that customer value mapping should highlight where your drivers are. And then if you were acquiring a business that had value drivers in different parts of the process, then that's where you'd want to make sure that whatever process it's being integrated into can accommodate those. So I'll move to the organizational structure and employees evaluation. So this is the structure of the entire organization, which means where the new business will roll up into the acquiring organization, as well as the reporting structure and team structure for the businesses. So here you'd want to consider if it's a carve out versus stock deal, because that would determine which employees are coming with the deal and which areas that you may need to have a TSA for to support the process before you're able to fill roles within your business. This includes the employee role mapping, sales territory alignment, reorganizations, culture, key talent. One good example is that the team should ask the question, are any customers loyal to certain salespeople or account managers? So would the customer go with the salesperson if that person went to a competitor? And I've seen that in practice, actually. So you really need to ask that question, identify those salespeople and account managers as key talent, and have a plan in place to retain them.
This kind of gets a lot of the odds and ends right here in this. Now, do you look at these different sections as work streams specifically, or how's like that approach in terms of executing in these areas?
You can see I have the columns with each of the business processes. And then I have the functional work areas down the side. And then here, and this is based on my lens from Cardinal Health, the level of involvement of each of those functional areas within each of those business processes, high, medium, low. And so for the medium, low, you would probably invite them to the first conversation with the highs, just to, like I said, rule out scope, make sure you're not, missing anything. But your teams that are going to be most involved would be the medium and highs with each of these. So when you say, is it going to be a work stream? I probably would have an order to cash work stream, and that would consist of all of these teams with medium and high next to it. But I probably would have one business process owner.
And they got to work across all those functions to accomplish their things to do.
Right. So I would probably have order to cash meetings. Like I wouldn't have just a finance meeting or an accounting meeting. Now, where I would have a functional area as its own work stream would be something like HR. Even though HR crosses everything, I probably would pull them out as their own separate work stream.
So everything you're essentially creating is cross-functional teams.
Right.
And you're building out your work stream based on sort of the big part of the process that you're executing on.
Right. Because what we were running into was, for procure to pay, we would go to and again, this is a symptom of like a business being so large that your work is broken up across 20 different teams. We're in a smaller business that might be across 5. Mm-hmm. But we were working with the direct procurement team, but you can see that master data needs to be involved, treasury, the ops team, sourcing, finance and accounting all need to be at the table to have a really constructive conversation around how you're going to integrate your procure to pay.
Right. That's actually good how you prioritized within those like pillars of what you're driving towards an integration of who exactly need to get involved when. Well, and the priority of having them involved.
Yeah, a good example for order to cash is everyone forgets about sales tax until you haven't been collecting sales tax when you should have been.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like I double check to make sure that when I am having a meeting that I reference this to have the right people at the table.
How many cats do you actually end up herding throughout the process on a typical deal?
I would say 40 to 80.
Wow.
At any given time. I mean, IT is a huge organization, so they probably have 20 on their own with all the different IT components.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, there's a lot of elements you can expand on and how do you approach the project management of it. And it's a lot of stuff I keep referencing agile because I see that even the cross functional nature of the way you're structuring teams to go execute on a plan that's prioritized based on value drivers.
Hmm.
Really interesting stuff.
We're almost.
For a big company, you're not way off. I'm sorry, what were you saying?
Oh, go ahead.
I was saying for a large organization, you're not as sort of behind times in terms of the approach on doing these things. It seems like a lot of lessons learned over experience.
Yeah, yeah, I learned a lot actually in a short amount of time. But again, going back to my background, I think I spent the last 18 years preparing for this with all my business process learnings. The general rule is do your homework because you'll tweak one piece of the process that is seemingly disconnected from 10 steps from that, but you end up breaking something.
I was picking that up as a theme on this, that while you're doing this, you're trying to proactively identify what are the breaking points. You mentioned that with the limits of systems and adding all the new volume of activity. So it seems like that's a big part of it is you got to keep this radar out for things that'll break along the way.
Right. It's almost like assume everything's going to break and go wrong. And so you have to narrow down on how to not make that happen. I
Good
think
way to do it.
people falsely assume the other direction that, oh, this will integrate seamlessly. They sell stuff, we sell stuff. It'll be
I like
fine.
that. Assume everything's going to break and figure out how not to let that happen.
Okay, two more buckets. The sales incentives. So your sales incentive program and programs objectives, incentive percent amounts, the payout structure. I mean, I think teams should really be thoughtful here. And this is where, the human component comes in. You're bringing two different teams together. They might have completely different incentive programs. So leadership really needs to take a step back and say, how do we want to incentivize these teams to work together to sell what we're trying to sell? But from a back office standpoint, really this one, the highlight is in the prospect to customer process where you have your managed variable compensation. So you could have a system that manages this for you. I think surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, a lot of teams do this manually in Excel based on sales data. So any adjustments that you're going to make with bringing new sales folks in, or maybe revamping the compensation process or the incentives, you have to make sure that this step is covered in the integration.
Keeping sales reps happy. It's important to capture revenue synergies.
Exactly. That's exactly. Do you have to create, that's a good point. Do you have to create a whole new incentive to meet your deal objectives? You want to make sure that, however, the program is structured today isn't going against your deal objectives. And then lastly, we kind of come to the catch-all sales process and enablers. So this is the overall sales process and the strengths and weaknesses for the business. This is where the team would discuss enablers required to achieve the revenue objectives of the deal. So this is where you ask the sales team, what do you need to be successful? Like, what is in the process today that would inhibit you from being successful? Is there something in the process that we want to, from the business that we're bringing over that enables success that we don't want to break? So this is really a good opportunity for the combined teams to build the optimal process to support sales efforts. And then from a back office perspective, for prospect to customer, your integration points would be anything that enables cross-selling if you're bringing new products into the picture, and anything to enable building that healthy sales pipeline. So looking at how you manage your sales pipeline. But then it also is dependent a little bit ambiguous on whatever the team identifies that enables them. So it could be any part of the process really that they identify as an enabler. So after doing that mapping, and like you said, iteratively, maybe a couple rounds, a couple workshops, bringing, the further along you get into the deal, the more access you're going to have. You can go deeper into the teams to get more, to draw the expertise out. And so you would complete that, have a report out of some sort for leadership, and then that should inform the guidance that the business gives for the integration of the future state of the business. So are processes and teams going to be absorbed into the acquiring business unit, into the acquired business unit, or is it going to be a hybrid where it's the best of both business approach, which is ideal, but probably the harder of the integration choices.
Where are you at in the process right around close? Like how much of this do you have figured out versus how much do you end up figuring out after close?
It depends. I guess you probably hear that a lot, but if you have a nice chunk of time between sign and close, you can actually get a lot done, because typically by the time you sign, the sprint to get the legal, tax, finance due diligence is kind of out of the way, and you have more opportunity to get time on calendars to do the integration planning. So if you're going to have a quick sign and close, you'll probably have to wait till after to really dive in and get access to the experts. I would say that you do it as early as feasibly possible. As I mentioned, every deal will be different. Every deal has different priorities and timing. Sometimes the IMO gets the pushback on planning because the team is so focused on due diligence. So my advice would be that you assess the risk of postponing the assessment. And since the IMO team typically has that big picture view, we would evaluate if the success of the deal relies heavily on revenue synergies and nailing the go-to-market strategy. So if that's the case, the deal is very revenue heavy. The IMO should insist on starting that assessment process as soon as possible. But if you have a deal that's more of a tuck into the core business, or if it's more of a cost savings play, you could probably get away with executing the assessment later.
I could just imagine you, Dustin, asking that, like, how important is your, synergies around revenue? And then you just be like, yeah, that's what I thought. Get me in there.
Well, I mean, because of my finance background, I just go into the deal model and pull that info myself. Like I don't even wait to ask. I actually have probably teach a different class on synergies and best practices around those. But I have a template that I fill out, and that's where I get a sense of like where my integration work is going to be.
That makes a lot of sense. You got the full spectrum to be able to get that access to that information and respond accordingly.
And I guess a takeaway, or to sum up the timing of it, I mean, just like anything, it's important to take the time in the beginning of the planning process as much as possible so you can save time from misalignment and confusion in the execution phase where the stakes are a lot higher.
What does reporting to leadership look like? What is expected there? What do you provide?
Usually we have, if it's a huge deal, we're going to have a steering committee of really high level leaders, but we always have an executive sponsor. And it could be that we report directly to that executive sponsor on either a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, depending on where you are at the deal. Sometimes that sponsor likes to have their finance, HR, important business partners at the table for that report out as well.
The other question I had in mind was, when you think about overall integration, like what portion of all of it, well, I guess, again, it's going to depend on the deal. So we'll get that out of the way. But just thinking about yours go to market, but then everything else outside of go to market, how does that compare with the rest of the overall slice of the pie? Is it just mainly the straightforward kind of cost synergy type of integrations?
So yeah, it's go-to-market will be a lot higher for those revenue synergy deals. And a lot higher if we're getting into new territories. So that's where on the framework, we do have a section that says new to the acquiring business current state, because those are things we're going to have to learn. We're going to have to get up to speed. Ideally, you'll have key talent staying on from the acquired company to help get you there. That's why they're identified as key talent and why we have retention programs. But yeah, it's the more differences there are, the heavier the integration and the learning curve will be.
More emphasis you should make if that's what you're betting on.
Yep.
What about budgeting for this? We've referenced that a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you begin in just thinking through how do you budget expenses? Is it something that you try to get your different leaders and to roll up that information to you? And how pragmatic do you get about it?
Yeah, it's actually part of our due diligence process where we collect information from each of the teams, each of the work streams. So this is more at the functional level versus the business process level. But they actually, turn in a template where they have any incremental recurring costs that they think we're going to incur because of the deal. So it's not in our run rate, it's not in their run rate, but then also all integration costs that we need to consider for the deal. So that a lot of it's usually IT setup, setting them up on Cardinal's network, devices, things like that. Something for go-to-market. So that's where, if we actually have a cheat sheet for each of the areas, but you'd want to think about your marketing collateral. Are we going to have to buy brand new collateral, invest in that? Do we do trade shows? Everything down to updating the logo on our trade show setup, the tablecloth, everything like that, business cards.
Does budgeting for integration vary wildly deal by deal, or do you see a certain range it typically falls in? And is that like benchmark against percentage of deal size?
It's actually, I always joke that it's inversely related. So it's the smaller deals that are actually going to be more expensive to integrate, because if you think about it, a smaller team, a smaller company, they're probably on QuickBooks or some sort of nimble accounting system. Cardinal Health uses SAP. To build anything in SAP is expensive, right? So to do it the quote unquote right way, where you're trying to integrate and get all businesses onto a common platform, it's actually more expensive to integrate the little guys.
Now that makes sense. I never thought about it that way.
And network, something like the network, it's kind of no matter, it's more of like how many facilities and building sizes versus the actual cost of the business. So you could be buying a tiny company, but if they have a huge office that we're trying to get on our network, proportionally, it would look really weird compared to a bigger business with the same office space.
Yes.
So this is where, the tech companies get super expensive.
Right. Totally different approach needed. What are things to watch out for when doing this for the first time?
Skipping the process mapping portion. So that's kind of when I get on my soapbox and insist that if the teams don't already have a process map of their business processes for current state, that we get those. Teams like to blow past that step, but really this is where the maxim go slow to go fast comes into play, because a lot of people are working off of their own mental map of what that process looks like. And that could be based on their heuristics, based on their experience with the process, or even more dangerously, their non-experience with the process. Just making assumptions of like, oh, I assume this is how we invoice. So really mapping it out and getting everyone on the same page is step one in my mind. I would also say making sure that the leadership is bought into this exercise. Some leaders want to kind of blow over the project management portion of the program. Again, the whole idea of go slow to go fast. So you really want leadership support that this is a worthwhile exercise and the team should take the time to sit down and complete it and be very deliberate with how they think through it. And then also remembering that this is a framework. It's supposed to be flexible depending on the deal. I kind of feel like I sound like a politician with that answer. It depends on the deal. So it really, the team needs to focus on the areas that are relevant to hitting those objectives.
Yeah, it sounds like knowing your own organization and processes, having it mapped out really well to benchmark or compare with the company you're acquiring is key. Hence the process mapping part, leadership buy-in, and then, keeping in mind it's a framework that it'll continue to adjust and evolve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are other lessons learned from your experience?
To not only focus on the front office piece, so that would be the sales team and the marketing program, that you need that sound infrastructure and process in place to support your execution, and not discounting the complexity of what that infrastructure may look like. Just in general, if your plan is to grow inorganically through M&A, you really need to sit down before you dig into M&A to make sure that you're defining your back office execution requirements early on in that process. So businesses tend to customize their systems to fit their business at that point in time perfectly, sometimes to a fault. And the more customization you add to your system, the harder it is to scale, and you lose flexibility. So if you are planning to scale with the new revenue streams, as I mentioned earlier, try to make decisions so your hands aren't tied down the road. So basically build your systems with the future in mind. And it may be that we have no idea what the future holds. It could be products and services that don't exist today. You see how new products are popping up in the market that we didn't even dream about 10 years ago. But at least keeping that in mind, that we may need to solve for something that doesn't exist today, just so that you have that flexibility to do so, or you prepare yourself for the cost to do so and plan accordingly from a capital perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a really fair point. Keep your eye around the corner to plan ahead.
Yeah. Another point that I found during this process, which I think it's so cool when people have their aha moments during exercises like this, because these are the exercises people kind of roll their eyes and groan about. And then you set them down and you walk through it and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. But I've seen where the IT infrastructure and commercial technology implementation timeline was out of sync with the go-to-market target dates. So for example, we took the go-to-market timeline, including any pilots and launches that were dependent on the IT development. And when we did this exercise early on, we realized that one of the key IT development deliverables to support the solution was going to be completed 6 months after our pilot target date. So we had that conversation during due diligence. We were able to make adjustments to the timeline and assumptions before the deal model was locked down.
It's gotta be flexible and adaptive.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about putting it on paper and getting it in front of people. It's like the simplest thing.
Yeah, it sounds like it's very collaborative at that point because you have some documentation around it. You're inviting the feedback and you're communicating the whole plan to everybody.
Yeah. Actually have my boss says, clear writing is clear thinking. And actually have it written on my little whiteboard behind me because it's so true. I guess one final lessons learned is this is kind of where you can make a bad assumption if they are on the same system. So let's say you're on an ERP system and you're purchasing a company on the same ERP system. kind of going back to my earlier call out around customization, each business probably made customization decisions around their offerings at that point in time. So you wouldn't want to overlook and not budget for integration there. You'd really have to dive in to see if you are going to migrate one of the businesses to a single system, that system can accommodate it, or if you need to actually build things out within it.
It's a lot to think about altogether.
A lot to think about.
Dustin, I got to ask, what's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
Oh, I don't integrate and tell.
Don't integrate and tell?
Ask me in maybe 20 years when it's not.
Oh my God, you could scratch out the names and dates and,
Maybe offline.
Okay, fair enough. I know it's tough when you haven't been in several roles to sort of bury the story. It's
Right.
kind of sort of identifiable in your circumstance.
Exactly.
So we may give you an exception on this, Dustin, but over happy hour sometime we'll have to catch up on some stories.
For sure. Maybe we can have a in-person, no recordings.
We do. We've been doing more of those. If you're going to be in New York the rest of this month, I'm going to be out there, and we have a couple events we're hosting.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, I'm sure at some point we'll cross paths there. This has been really great. I appreciate taking the time, and yeah, this has been really valuable. I like this walkthrough approach that you had. It makes a lot of sense. It gets a bigger picture thinking around how go-to-market integration comes together.
Yeah, actually, I have another analogy I'll share with you that I use, and it kind of coincides with your agile approach. And before agile became a really popular term, we've actually used the flashlight analogy, where you have a tiny flashlight in a pitch black room, and that room is basically your integration discovery. And the more you walk around and the more you learn, your flashlight beam gets bigger and bigger and bigger till eventually you can see the full picture. And that's what this process does. It just helps you get more and more of that bigger picture.
I like that. That's a really good analogy. It just over time, you'll get the full picture. So you got to keep shining your flashlight around until you get it all.
Right.
Really
Look
cool.
at all the corners under the bed.
Well, thanks so much, Dustin. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Here's to the deal.
What?
I said, here's to the deal. It's our closing line. Thanks again. Here's to the deal.
Okay, here's to the deal.